December 1900. Far out in the unforgiving Atlantic Ocean, where towering waves pound black volcanic cliffs and winter storms can erase entire ships from existence, a lonely lighthouse stands watch over one of the most isolated places in Britain. Its light should be visible for miles. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers should be tending their lantern, recording the weather and waiting for the weekly supply ship. Instead, silence. As the relief vessel Hesperus approaches the island, something feels terribly wrong. No welcoming signal. No movement near the landing platform. No figures standing beside the tower. When the crew finally climbs the steep stone steps and enters the lighthouse, the lamps have been cleaned. The beds have been slept in. The kitchen appears recently used, but the 3 men responsible for the lighthouse have vanished. No bodies, no signs of violence, no farewell message, only questions that have haunted investigators for more than a century. What really happened on Flannan Isles? Tonight, we return to the island, not to chase legends, but to examine one of the greatest unsolved maritime mysteries ever recorded. Long before satellites guided ships across the oceans, long before radar pierced darkness and fog, the sea belonged to uncertainty. A single mistake could send an entire crew to the bottom of the Atlantic. Throughout the 19th century, thousands of vessels crossed the dangerous waters surrounding the northern coast of Scotland. Powerful currents collided with hidden reefs. Dense fog could appear without warning. Winter storms transformed calm seas into walls of black water capable of swallowing even the strongest ships. To sailors, a lighthouse was far more than a building. It was hope, a promise that someone, somewhere, was watching. Among the many lighthouses guarding Britain's coastline, few stood in a place as isolated as the Flannan Isles. Located more than 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, this tiny group of rocky islands rises abruptly from the Atlantic like forgotten pieces of another world. For centuries, local fishermen treated the islands with unusual respect. Ancient stories spoke of strange presences. Some refused to spend the night there. Others believed unseen forces watched over the cliffs long before any lighthouse was ever built. Whether those tales were born from superstition or generations of sailors confronting nature at its most violent, no one can say. But one fact is beyond dispute. The Atlantic around Flannan Isles is among the harshest environments in Europe. Winds can exceed hurricane force. Waves explode against the cliffs with incredible violence. Landing on the island often becomes impossible for days. Yet despite these dangers, the increasing number of merchant ships crossing the area demanded a permanent lighthouse. Construction began during the late 19th century. Every stone, every iron beam, every heavy lance had to be transported across unpredictable seas before being hauled by hand up steep cliffs. It was exhausting work, dangerous work. But when the Great Tower was finally completed, it became a symbol of humanity's determination to challenge one of nature's most unforgiving frontiers. Each evening, as darkness swallowed the Atlantic, a brilliant beam swept across the waves. To passing captains, that light meant safety. To the 3 men living inside the tower, it meant something very different. It meant weeks without seeing another human being. The same stone walls, the same crashing waves, the same endless horizon. Every sunrise, every sunset, every storm. Together, yet completely alone. Life inside the lighthouse followed an almost military routine. The lantern had to remain flawless. Every mechanism required constant maintenance. Oil levels were checked repeatedly. Weather conditions were carefully recorded. Any mistake could cost dozens of lives at sea. The work demanded discipline, patience, and above all, trust. Because on a tiny island surrounded by hundreds of miles of open ocean, each keeper depended entirely on the other two. They lived together, worked together, faced every storm together. No one could have imagined that before the year was over, all three would disappear without leaving a single confirmed answer. Long before anyone vanished, before newspaper headlines, before investigators searched empty rooms, there was only the ocean, endless, cold, and impossibly powerful. Far beyond Scotland's western coast, where the Atlantic stretches toward North America without interruption, a small chain of rocky islands rises from the sea. These are the Flannan Isles, remote, treeless, battered by a relentless wind and towering waves. Among them stands the largest island, Eilean Moor. Even today, reaching it depends entirely on the mood of the Atlantic. Some days, the sea welcomes visitors. On others, it refuses them completely. The cliffs surrounding the island climb almost vertically from the water, their dark rock polished by centuries of crushing waves. During winter, every storm transforms the island into a battlefield between stone and sea. Waves explode against the cliffs with enough force to throw white water higher than the buildings. The air fills with salt spray. The wind screams through every crack in the rock. Nothing here feels designed for human life. Yet in the late 19th century, humanity decided to challenge this place. As maritime trade expanded, more ships crossed these dangerous waters than ever before. Captains knew the reputation of the Flannan Isles well. Hidden reefs, violent currents, sudden fog. Entire vessels had disappeared in these waters long before anyone could explain why. The Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that something had to be done. Not to conquer the Atlantic, that was impossible, but to help sailors survive it. Construction of the lighthouse began in 1895. The project immediately proved far more difficult than engineers had anticipated. Every brick, every iron beam, every pane of glass, every heavy mechanical component had to survive the journey across rough seas before workers could even begin carrying it up the island. There were no roads, no cranes, no machines powerful enough to simplify the task. Only ropes, wooden sledges, human determination, and patience. On calm mornings, laborers hauled enormous stones up steep paths carved into the cliffs. Hours later, the weather could change without warning. Dark clouds would roll across the Atlantic. Rain would fall sideways. Powerful gusts would force everyone to abandon their work and seek shelter. Sometimes supplies remained stranded offshore for days because landing had become impossible. Every completed war represented another small victory against nature. Month after month, the tower slowly climbed toward the sky. From a distance, it appeared almost fragile, a narrow column of stone standing against one of the harshest environments on Earth. Yet appearances were deceiving. Its walls measured nearly a meter thick, designed to withstand Atlantic storms that had shattered ships into splinters. Inside, A spiral staircase wound upward through the tower like the spine of a giant stone creature. At the very top waited the heart of the lighthouse, a magnificent Flannan lens, one of the greatest engineering achievements of its era. Carefully polished glass prisms surrounded the power lamp, bending and focusing its light into a brilliant beam capable of reaching more than 20 miles across the sea. Night after night, that beam would rotate slowly through the darkness, searching, warning, guiding. For sailors fighting exhaustion, fog, and violent seas, it often became the first reassuring sight after days of uncertainty. Finally, on the evening the lighthouse entered service, the lantern came alive. As darkness settled across the Atlantic, the great lens began its silent rotation. Its brilliant white beam swept across black water, across lonely waves, across hidden reefs, across ships whose crews would never know the names of the men keeping that light alive. To the world, the lighthouse represented safety, progress, human ingenuity. But to the keepers, who would soon call Eilean home, it represented something else entirely. Isolation, responsibility, and a life where the nearest neighbor was not another village, but the endless Atlantic itself. For weeks at a time, the sea would decide whether anyone arrived or whether no one left. And in December of 1900, that isolation would become the center of one of history's most enduring mysteries. By the winter of 1900, the lighthouse had become more than a remarkable feat of engineering. It had become a home. Not a comfortable one, but a home nonetheless. Every rotation brought 3 men to Eilean, where they would spend weeks together before another relief crew arrived from the mainland. The sea decided when supplies came. The weather decided when anyone could leave. And during the long Scotch winter, the outside world often felt unimaginably distant. Every morning began the same way. Long before sunrise, one of the keepers would wake to the low whistle of wind squeezing through the stone tower. The Atlantic never truly slept. Even on calm nights, the constant rhythm of waves crashing against the cliffs echoed through the walls like the slow heartbeat of the island itself. The first task was always the lantern. Hundreds of lives depended on that light remaining visible through the darkness, rain, and fog. There could be no mistakes, no forgotten maintenance, no shortcuts. Every gear had to be inspected, every glass panel cleaned until it sparkled, every reservoir checked, every moving part lubricated with care. Inside the lantern room, silence was broken only by the soft ticking of gears and the distant roar of the sea below. Leading the station was James Ducat. At 43 years old, he was respected throughout the Northern Lighthouse service for his discipline and reliability. Years of working along Scotland's dangerous coastline had carved deep lines into his face. He spoke little, not because he was unfriendly, but because routine demanded concentration. Each morning after inspecting the lantern, Ducat carefully opened the station logbook. With steady handwriting, he recorded the time, the weather, wind direction, visibility, sea conditions, oil consumption. Every detail mattered. To most people, the pages would seem painfully ordinary, but for lighthouse keepers, those entries were the official memory of the island. If something went wrong, the logbook would tell the story. Working beside him was Thomas Marshall, the second keeper. Marshall possessed a calm personality, methodical, patient. He often spent hours maintaining the intricate brass mechanisms that rotated the massive Flannan lens. Every polished surface reflected the warm glow of the lamp. Every gear had to move with perfect precision. He believed machines deserved respect. If you care for them, he once reportedly told another keeper, they'll care for the sailors. It was quiet work, the kind that rewarded patience more than strength. Then there was Donald MacArthur. Unlike the others, MacArthur wasn't originally assigned as a permanent keeper. He was serving as a replacement while another man was away. Formerly known for his energetic personality and fearless confidence, he brought a different rhythm to life inside the tower. He moved faster, talked more, sometimes paced near the windows, staring toward the restless horizon. He had spent much of his life facing Scotland's unforgiving weather. Yet even he occasionally paused to admire the Atlantic. It was impossible not to. Some mornings, sunlight painted the sea with shimmering silver. Hours later, the same water could become an endless field of black mountains crashing against the cliffs. No 2 days looked alike. Despite their differences, the three men depended on one another completely. There were no neighbors, no shops, no newspaper delivered every morning, no unexpected visitors, only each other. Meals became important moments. Simple food, fresh bread when supplies allowed, salted meat, soup simmering slowly over the stove, strong tea warming cold hands after hours spent outside in bitter wind. Conversations drifted between stories of home, fishing villages, children waiting on the mainland, plans of Christmas, and speculation about the weather. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes the room fell silent. Isolation changes people in different ways. Some become more talkative, others disappear into their own thoughts. When work was finished, one keeper usually climbed outside for another inspection of the buildings surrounding the lighthouse. The Atlantic left no room for complacency. Railings loosened, ropes frayed, equipment shifted. A single damaged crane could become disastrous when the next supply ship arrived. Everything had to be ready, everything had to function, because if the weather suddenly turned, there might not be another chance for days. As evening approached, darkness returned quickly. The great lamp was lit once again. Slowly, the enormous lens began its endless rotation. Far below, somewhere beyond the darkness, ship crossed the Atlantic without ever seeing the man responsible for that reassuring beam. Invisible guardians, known only by the light they kept alive. Night settled over Eilean more. The wind strengthened. The sea grew louder. Inside the lighthouse, the three keepers continued their routine, unaware that history would remember them not for the lives they saved, but for the mystery they would leave behind. December arrived quietly. Winter had settled over the North Atlantic with an icy grip, shortening the days and stretching the nights until darkness seemed to consume the island for nearly 16 hours at a time. Far from Scottish mainland, Christmas carried little meaning on Eilean Moor. There were no church bells, no crowded streets, no families gathered around warm fireplaces. Only three men, a stone tower, and an ocean that never stopped breathing. A few days before Christmas, the relief vessel made its routine visit. The crew unloaded fresh barrels of paraffin oil, sacks of flour, preserved meat, tea, coal, and mail from home. For a brief moment, the island came alive. Voices echoed across the landing platform. Boots scraped against the wet stone. Laughter cut through the relentless sound of the sea. The keepers exchanged a few words with the sailors, helped unload supplies, and watched as the cargo disappeared into the lighthouse. It was a welcome interruption to weeks of isolation. But like every visit before it, it ended too soon. The ropes were untied, the engines rumbled to life. Slowly, the supply vessel drifted away from the cliffs. The man stood in silence, watching until the ship became nothing more than a dark silhouette against the grey horizon. Within minutes, they were alone again, completely alone. The Atlantic had reclaimed the island. Inside the lighthouse, life returned to its familiar rhythm. James Ducat carefully entered another routine report into the station logbook. Wind direction, sea conditions, visibility, oil consumption. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Thomas Marshall climbed into the lantern room, where he spent the afternoon polishing the giant Flannan lens. Every fingerprint had to disappear. Every glass prism had to remain crystal clear. He knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, captains trusted that beam with their lives. Donald MacArthur ventured outside once more, inspecting ropes, pulleys, and western landing platform. Winter storms had a habit of loosening bolts and damaging equipment without warning. Every exposed piece of metal had to be checked, every chain secured, every crane examined. On an island like Eilean, neglect was dangerous. As daylight faded, the wind strengthened. The lighthouse lantern came alive once more, sending its brilliant beam across the restless Atlantic. Somewhere out there, invisible beyond the darkness, merchant ships altered their course after spotting the familiar light. Inside the tower, the three keepers gathered around the wooden dining table. Steam rose from bowls of hot soup. Fresh bread was sliced. Tin mugs filled with strong tea warmed frozen hands. For a short while, conversation replaced silence. They spoke about home, about families waiting on the mainland, about the coming new year, about how long the weather might delay the next relief ship. Simple conversations, ordinary conversations, the kind no one remembers until they become the last. Outside, the Atlantic was changing. Clouds gathered low over the horizon. The wind shifted direction. The temperature dropped sharply. Experienced sailors knew these signs well. Something larger was approaching. The sea always announced its intentions if one knew how to listen. By the following morning, waves had begun crashing against the cliffs. With increasing violence, the sound echoed continuously through the stone walls. Heavy spray reached heights rarely seen during calmer months, coating windows with salt before freezing into thin layers of ice. Still, the keepers continued their duties. Routine was everything. Routine created order, and order kept fear away. James Ducat recorded another entry in the logbook. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming. Just another winter day on one of Britain's most isolated outposts. If anyone had opened the logbook that evening, they would have seen nothing suggesting that history was about to change. No desperate warnings, no mysterious messages, no hint that these ordinary records would soon become some of the most closely examined pages in maritime history. As darkness fell once again, the Atlantic disappeared beneath a curtain of rain. The lighthouse beam continued its endless sweep across the sea. Round after round after round, somewhere beyond the horizon, ships sailed safely because of that light. Inside the tower, three men prepared for another ordinary night. None of them could possibly know that this would be among the last peaceful hours anyone could confidently place them alive. For days, the Atlantic had been growing increasingly restless. What began as an ordinary winter storm slowly evolved into something far more intimidating. Dark clouds swallowed the horizon long before sunset. The air became heavier, colder. Even inside the lighthouse, every gust of wind could be heard forcing its way through the tiny cracks in the thick stone walls. Outside, the sea was changing. Towering waves rolled in from the open Atlantic like moving mountains, crashing against the cliffs with explosive force. Each impact sent towering walls of white spray high into the freezing air. The sound never stopped. It echoed through the island day and night, constant reminder that nature always stronger. Inside the lantern room, James Ducat stood silently beside the great Flannan lens. Its brilliant beam continued sweeping across the darkness exactly as it had every night before. Round after round after round. Ships somewhere beyond the horizon depended on that rhythm. No matter how violent the storm became, the light could never fail. Below him, Thomas Marshall carefully inspected the machinery one final time before recording another routine maintenance check. Years of experience had taught him one simple lesson: storms reveal every weakness. A loose bolt, a worn gear, a neglected hinge. Small problems became dangerous when the Atlantic lost its patience. Donald MacArthur stepped outside briefly between violent gusts. The wind immediately grabbed at his heavy oilskin coat. Rain struck his face like tiny pieces of ice. He walked carefully toward the western landing, checking the crane used to unload supplies from visiting ships. Everything appeared secure, but the sea below looked different, even for a man accustomed to Scottish winters. The waves seemed unusually aggressive. He stood for a moment, watching, listening, then returned inside without saying much. As evening approached, darkness arrived earlier than usual. The horizon disappeared completely behind sheets of rain. The lighthouse became an isolated island of warm light, surrounded by endless blackness. Inside, life continued according to routine. Coal crackled inside the fireplace. Tea boiled gently on the stove. The smell of damp pool filled the room as heavy coats dried near the fire. Someone turned another page in the station logbook. Another ordinary entry. Another ordinary day, or so it seemed. Outside, the wind grew louder. Not simply louder, different. It howled through the cliffs with strange shifting tones that rose and fell like distant voices carried across the sea. Old lighthouse keepers often spoke of these sounds, not as ghosts, not as supernatural warnings, but as one countless strange noises produced when hurricane-force winds collided with jagged stone. Still, on lonely islands, even ordinary sounds can become unsettling. Hour after hour, the storm continued. The beam of the lighthouse swept faithfully across walls of rain and sea spray. Its light vanished into the darkness, then returned again and again. Somewhere far below, enormous waves slammed against the western landing platform. Wooden crates shifted. Chains strained under incredible tension. Iron fittings groaned as thousands of tons of moving water battered the cliffs. No one could know exactly what the three keepers saw that night. No eyewitness survived to tell the story. No camera recorded those final hours. Only the storm remained, and the silence that followed. When dawn finally arrived, the Atlantic showed no sign of mercy. The sea churned violently around Eilean Moor. The lighthouse continued shining. But something, somewhere, had already changed forever. For nearly a week, the sea refused to let anyone reach Eilean Moor. Relief crews waited. Captains watched the weather. The Atlantic made the decision for everyone. Only on the morning of December 26th, 1900, did the storm finally loosen its grip. The supply vessel Hesperus cut steadily through the cold grey water, its bow rising and falling over the long Atlantic swells. Captain James Harvey stood quietly on the bridge, studying the familiar outline of the island as it slowly emerged from the morning mist. Something immediately felt wrong. Normally, long before the ship reached the landing platform, one of the keepers would already be outside. The sound of the ship's whistle echoed across the cliffs. One blast, then another, then a third. The echoes rolled across the empty island before disappearing into silence. No figure appeared. No hand waved from the tower. No movement, only the endless sound of the ocean. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Perhaps the man simply hadn't heard. The engines slowed. Heavy ropes were prepared. Again, the whistle cried through the cold air. Still, nothing. Captain Harvey frowned. He had visited dozens of remote stations throughout his career. The keepers always answered. Always. This time, there was only silence. Unable to dock the larger vessel directly against the cliffs, a small boat was lowered into the water. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, climbed aboard. He had performed this journey many times before. Yet something about that morning made every stroke of the oars feel unusually heavy. As the small boat reached the landing platform, Moore stepped onto the wet stone. The island felt strangely lifeless. Normally, someone would already be walking down the path to greet him. Instead, only the wind moved. He began climbing the steep staircase carved into the cliff. Hundreds of stone steps wound upward toward the lighthouse. His boots echoed sharply against the damp rock. Each step carried him farther from the sea and deeper into an unsettling silence. Halfway up, he stopped. He listened. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Not even the familiar sound of work coming from inside the tower. Only distant waves crashing against the cliffs below. When Moore finally reached the lighthouse courtyard, the silence became almost unbearable. The flagpole stood still. No laundry fluttered in the wind. No tools had been left outside. Everything appeared strangely normal, yet completely abandoned. He walked toward the heavy entrance door. It wasn't locked. Slowly, he pushed it open. The thick wooden hinges groaned softly. The sound echoed through the empty building. "Hello?" His voice disappeared into the stone staircase. No answer. He stepped inside. The air was cold. Not freezing, but noticeably colder than it should have been if three men had been living there only moments before. The kitchen was tidy. The oil lamps had been cleaned. The beds were neatly arranged. Nothing appeared ransacked. Nothing suggests panic. Everything looked exactly as responsible lighthouse keepers would have left it, if they expected to return within minutes. Moore moved carefully from room to room. The dining table remained set. A few dishes were still in place. The fireplace contained cold ashes. The silence followed him everywhere. He climbed the spiral staircase toward the lantern room. Every step creaked beneath his boots. At the top, the great Flannan lens stood exactly where it belonged, spotless, perfectly maintained, ready for another night's work. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, no desperate message scratched into the walls. Only absence, an absence so complete that it felt almost unnatural. Trying to understand what he was seeing, Moore searched every corner of tower. storage rooms, sleeping quarters, the engine room. Nothing. 3 men had simply vanished. By the time Captain Harvey himself reached the lighthouse, the terrible truth had become impossible to ignore. The station had not been abandoned in haste. It had not been destroyed by fire. It had not been attacked. It was as though life had paused, and the men had quietly disappeared between one moment and the next. News spread quickly across the Scottish mainland. A lighthouse could not simply lose its entire crew. Not without explanation, not without witnesses, not without leaving something behind. Yet that was exactly what investigators now faced. A perfectly functioning lighthouse, 3 experienced keepers, and not a single confirmed clue revealing where they had gone. The mystery had officially begun. By the afternoon of December 26th, the lighthouse was no longer simply an isolated outpost. It had become a crime scene, or at least that was how it felt. Word of the disappearance spread quickly through the Northern Lighthouse Board. 3 experienced keepers had vanished without warning. No distress signal had ever been received. No passing ship had reported seeing men in the water. No wreckage floated nearby. It was as though the Atlantic had swallowed every answer. Before anyone even knew there were questions to ask. Within hours, officials began documenting everything they found. Nothing was considered too small. Every room was examined. Every object noted. Every irregularity carefully recorded. The first discovery surprised everyone. The lighthouse itself was functioning almost perfectly. The lantern room showed no signs of neglect. The enormous Flannan lens had been cleaned with exceptional care. The mechanisms remained in excellent condition. Oil supplies were sufficient. Everything suggested that the keepers had expected to continue their duties as usual. This was not the scene of men preparing to abandon their post. Investigators then moved through the living quarters. The beds had been used, cooking utensils remained neatly arranged. Food supplies were untouched. Nothing indicated panic, nothing suggested a violent struggle. It looked less like people had fled, and more like they had stepped outside for only a few minutes, yet they never returned. Then came one of the most discussed details of the entire case. Inside the entrance area, investigators examined the heavy oilskin coats worn during storms. According to official reports, one coat remained hanging inside the lighthouse. The other 2 were missing. That detail immediately raised troubling questions. If 2 men had gone outside, why had the third apparently followed without putting on his own protective coat? Every lighthouse keeper knew the Atlantic in winter. No experienced man willingly walked into a storm without proper clothing. It seemed completely out of character, unless he believed the situation outside was so urgent that there wasn't time. The investigation then shifted toward the western landing. This was the most dangerous part of the island. It served as the primary unloading point for supplies. Reaching it required descending steep stone paths exposed directly to the Atlantic. What investigators found there was remarkable. The storm had left unmistakable scars. A heavy storage box had been torn from its position. Iron railings showed signs of severe damage. Equipment normally secured high above the water had been displaced. Some reports even described enormous rocks moved by the force of the sea. To experienced engineers, the conclusion was obvious. The Atlantic had unleashed extraordinary power upon the island. Power far beyond an ordinary winter storm. But one question refused to disappear. If conditions had truly become that dangerous, why would all three keepers leave the lighthouse? Standard operating procedures discouraged exactly that. Normally, one keeper remained inside at all times. The lighthouse light could never be left unattended. It was one of the most important rules of the service. Could something have forced them all outside? Or had that rule somehow been broken? Investigators searched the surrounding cliffs for days. Every narrow path was examined, every crevice inspected. The sea below was watched constantly. No bodies appeared, no clothing washed ashore, no personal belongings were recovered. Nothing. The Atlantic kept its silence. As reports reached newspapers across Britain, public fascination exploded. Readers expected investigators to uncover a dramatic explanation. Instead, officials found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth. There was no single piece of evidence capable of explaining exactly what had happened. Only fragments, a cleaned lantern, 2 missing coats, 1 coat left behind, storm damage near the western landing, and 3 men who had simply ceased to exist. For investigators, the case was becoming increasingly frustrating. Every clue seemed to point toward an answer, yet every answer created another mystery. More than a century later, historians continue to study those same reports, not because they provide certainty, but because they don't. The official documents reveal just enough to ignite the imagination, and just little enough to ensure the truth remains forever beyond our reach. More than a century has passed since the 3 lighthouse keepers vanished from Eilean Moor. Time has weathered the stone walls. The Atlantic has erased countless traces. Yet the mystery refuses to fade. Why? Because every explanation seems convincing, until another piece of evidence refuses to fit. Over the decades, investigators, historians, sailors, and storytellers have all attempted to solve the same impossible puzzle. Each theory begins with confidence. Each one ends with uncertainty. Among maritime experts, one explanation has remained the most widely accepted, not because it answers every question, but because it demands the fewest assumptions. Imagine the western landing during the height of the storm. Wind screamed across the cliffs, rain reducing visibility to only a few meters, massive Atlantic swells crashing against the rocks below. Perhaps one keeper noticed that ropes securing the supply crane had broken loose, or a heavy equipment box had shifted dangerously toward the cliff edge. He leaves the lighthouse, wearing his oilskin coat. Another keeper follows to help. The third remains inside, watching from the window. Then something happens. Out beyond the rocks, an enormous wall of water begins to rise. Not an ordinary wave, a rogue wave. A rare giant formed when several powerful swells combine into one. For only a few seconds, it towers far above every wave before it. The 2 keepers never see it coming. The impact is catastrophic. The wave crashes over the landing. Iron railings bend, equipment is ripped away. Both men disappear instantly into the freezing Atlantic. Inside the lighthouse, the remaining keeper witnesses the disaster. Without stopping to grab his own coat, without thinking, he runs outside. His only concern is saving his friends. Moments later, another wave strikes, and he too is lost. Some historians believe the answer may be even simpler. No giant rogue wave, no extraordinary event, only one small decision, made at exactly the wrong moment. Winter storms often damaged ropes, cranes, and landing equipment. Perhaps routine maintenance became unavoidable. Perhaps one keeper slipped. Perhaps another rushed forward to help. The Atlantic offers little forgiveness. A single misstep on wet stone, a powerful gust of wind, one unexpected wave. Sometimes tragedy requires nothing more. Supporters of this theory argue that isolated workplaces often create chain reactions. One accident becomes two, two become three. Within minutes, an entire crew is gone. No mystery, only terrible timing. Yet, once again, there is one stubborn problem. No bodies were ever recovered, not one. Isolation changes people. Modern psychologists understand this well. Weeks of repetitive routine, constant exposure to violent weather, little sleep, no escape. The human mind can begin to interpret ordinary events differently. Some have suggested that stress may have triggered conflict among the keepers. Perhaps an argument, a moment of panic, a desperate decision. In such an isolated place, even small disagreements could feel enormous. But here, the historical evidence becomes extremely thin. Investigators found no signs of violence inside the lighthouse. No damaged furniture, no blood, no indication that a fight had taken place. The theory cannot be completely dismissed, yet it remains unsupported by physical evidence. Long before engineers built the lighthouse, long before charts marked these islands, the Flannan Isles already possessed a reputation. Local traditions spoke of strange presences, ancient spirits, sacred ground. Some fishermen reportedly avoided spending the night there. Others performed small rituals before coming ashore. As the news of the disappearance spread across Scotland, those old stories returned. For many people, the explanation was obvious. The island had reclaimed itself. 3 men had disturbed something ancient, something unseen. It is a captivating story, one repeated in books, television documentaries, and countless conversations. But history demands evidence, and despite its enduring appeal, no investigation has ever uncovered the proof supporting a supernatural explanation. The legends remain exactly that, legends. So, which theory is correct? Perhaps none of them. Perhaps each contains only part of the truth. History has a peculiar way of preserving some events, while allowing others to disappear forever. Battles leave behind weapons. Empires leave behind monuments. Great disasters leave scars that generations can still see. But every so often, history leaves us with nothing but questions. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers is one of those rare mysteries. Not because the event itself was impossible, but because almost every answer vanished with the men themselves. More than 100 years have passed. The lighthouse has been automated. The keepers are gone. The station no longer depends on human hands. Tourists occasionally visit the island when the sea allows. Researchers continue to examine weather records, official reports, newspaper archives, searching for the one overlooked detail that might finally solve the puzzle. Yet every investigation reaches the same point. The evidence ends and speculation begins. Some details once believed to be true have slowly faded under closer historical scrutiny. Stories of terrified diary entries have become part of popular folklore, but they are not supported by the surviving official records. Other details remain frustratingly uncertain. Did an unexpected rogue wave truly strike the western landing? Were the men attempting to secure damaged equipment? Did one keeper rush outside to save another? Or did something entirely different unfold during those final moments? No surviving witness can answer. The Atlantic never testified, and the island has remained silent. Perhaps that silence is the real reason this mystery continues to fascinate us. In an age where satellites monitor oceans, where aircraft scan entire coastlines, where almost every event leaves a digital footprint, it is difficult to imagine three experienced professionals simply disappearing. Yet that's exactly what happened. Not in the Middle Ages, not in ancient history, but at the dawn of the 20th century. Close enough to modern civilization, yet far enough from help. The Flannan Isles remind us that nature doesn't care about human certainty. The sea owes us no explanations. Sometimes the truth sinks beneath the waves, long before anyone realizes it should have been recorded. Perhaps one day, another document will emerge, a forgotten report, a letter hidden inside an archive, or new evidence waiting beneath the cliffs of Eilean Moor. But until that day arrives, the disappearance of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur remains exactly what it has always been, an unanswered question, ending on clear nights. The lighthouse still stands above the black cliffs of Eilean Moor. Its white tower watches the same Atlantic horizon, the same restless sea, the same endless waves that have battered these islands for thousands of years. If you enjoyed exploring one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, consider subscribing for more true stories, where history, evidence, and the unknown collide. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, reality has built-in errors.